Number 1. The Barn. This is a weird story that happened back when I was a teenager. My grandparents had a really small farm located in a small hollow. It wasn't a commercial farm, just something they had to support themselves. However, when they got older and it was more difficult for them to maintain the farm, they quit using the barn. It just sort of sat there and was used as a storage area mainly. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, we would go to our grandparents' house. This story took place on Thanksgiving. I was 15 years old, and that's the age where I began not enjoying hanging out with adults in my family anymore. Suddenly, listening to the stories of when I was a kid or when my parents were kids was just not that entertaining anymore. We had Thanksgiving dinner early. It was about 2 p.m. Afterward, I was beginning to feel a bit antsy. I let my parents know that I was going to go and explore the hollow a little bit. It had been a while since I had done so. I didn't even think of asking my younger brother and sister if they wanted to go. It was fine because, honestly, I felt like being by myself. I knew that I didn't really have a lot of time to explore before it got dark. So I set out and made sure I knew how far I could go and still get back before the sun had set. I didn't do the greatest job at it though. If you've ever been out exploring the woods, you might probably know what I mean. You can get easily fascinated with the woods and the hills and lose track of time. It got very, very dark before I was anywhere close to being home. By the time I got back to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I had never been out by the barn when it was dark outside. It looked incredibly creepy. Being a teenage boy, I of course liked scary things. Then, the thought occurred to me that if the barn was creepy looking on the outside, it must be really creepy on the inside. I decided to check it out. Getting into the barn was simple. My grandparents rarely locked the door of their house, much less thought about locking the barn. They lived in a really safe area where crime was pretty much unheard of. The barn did have one of those heavy wooden locks on it. Honestly, have no idea what they are called, but I was able to pull the wooden beam up. When I opened the barn door, it made a horribly loud creaking noise. I knew my grandparents had likely not been in the barn for years, so I was surprised I was able to get the door open at all. I figured the hinges had to nearly be rusted shut. As I mentioned, the barn was old, and even when it was in use, my grandparents would only have been in it during the day, so there was no light. Thank God that I live in the era of smartphones, though, because I of course had a flashlight on my smartphone. I turned on the flashlight and just marveled at the creepiness. If dark is creepy, then just a minor amount of light makes it much creepier. I was fascinated by all the tools. So many sharp implements. Most of them were hanging up. However, there was a small hatchet lying on a workbench. It was discolored, and on closer inspection, I realized that it was coated in dry blood. I don't know much about slaughtering animals, but I knew that my grandparents used to do it often. Chickens and pigs and stuff. So, I figured that the hatchet was used for that purpose, and that they just never cleaned it. The barn had a loft that was filled with hay. I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. When I was shining the light around, it reflected off something buried in the hay. I was wondering if it was another tool, or something, and I decided to check it out. Going over to it, I began moving the hay. I screamed when the empty eye sockets of a long dead corpse were staring directly at me. I fell backwards and nearly fell off the loft. I quickly climbed down the ladder and ran out of the barn without closing the door. I rushed into the house and told my parents and grandparents about what I had seen. My father, a huge man, like Hulk Hogan sized really, went out to confirm what I told him. My grandparents phoned the sheriff's office. The body had been in the loft for about 3 years. It had several hatchet wounds on it that the police told us were caused by the hatchet I'd seen on the bench, the hatchet I had picked up. So not only had I found a dead body, but I had held an actual murder weapon in my hand, and that was truly disturbing to me. But it wasn't nearly as disturbing as the realization my grandparents had that they had lived in the house for 3 years without knowing a dead body was in the barn. No one was ever caught, and we to this day have no idea who killed that man and why.
Number 2. Alone. I thought that going to college right out of high school was intimidating. I came from a small town, went to a huge college with an enrollment of over 50,000 students. It was crazy to me how active the campus was all the time. If I thought that was a culture shock though, it was nothing compared to what happened during Thanksgiving break. I didn't have the kind of money to be able to go home, so I remained in my dorm room alone during the break. I didn't realize that this left me being one of the only people in the dorm building, but not just only the dorm building, but also on the entire campus. What had so recently been just a metropolis of people became a barren wasteland. If the loneliness wasn't enough, a snowstorm hit the night before Thanksgiving. I recall waking up in the morning at about 7 a.m. and looking across a completely barren and desolate campus. Now, I suppose this doesn't seem weird at all, but it was a complete shock to me. Honestly, I spent the entire day on Wednesday in my dorm room, looking out over the campus. I didn't really even have the nerve to go out. However, I guess I began getting stir crazy on Thanksgiving. I had gotten myself a frozen turkey dinner that I was going to make in my microwave, but I really wanted to get out. There was a Denny's on campus, so I thought I would go and have dinner there. The dinner went fine, but I was uneasy because there was another guy in the restaurant who wouldn't stop staring at me. It made me uncomfortable. I normally like to take my time in a restaurant, but couldn't bring myself to do that here. So immediately after I was done eating, I left. Walking home, I nervously kept looking over my shoulder. It didn't take long before I noticed that the guy was following me, and he was walking faster than I was. By the time I had gotten to the dormitory doorway, he was already up the front steps. He called for me to hold the door for him, but I didn't. He seemed pretty old for a person living in the dorms, but if he was a student, he would have an electronic key card to let him in. I looked back as I went up the stairs and saw him standing in the foyer. I'm not sure how much later it was, but I heard a knocking on my door. I got up and looked out the peephole and was surprised to see the man from outside was standing at my front door. I wasn't sure how he had gotten in my dorm, nor how he found my room. Rather than acknowledge him, I went back to my desk quietly. He knocked a few more times and then left. About 5 hours later, I heard another knock at the door. At first, I of course expected it to be the man again. However, when I looked at the peephole, it was the campus police. I let them in. One of the other students that was in my dorm building had gotten attacked earlier in the day, and they wanted to know if I had seen anything suspicious. I explained my experience to them. They had arrested a suspect, and I had to go with them to see if I could identify the person. Indeed, it was the man who had followed me home from the Denny's. He apparently had gone door to door, knocking, and hadn't known where I was. he eventually came across someone who opened their door, and the person who did paid a terrible price.
Number 3. The Parade. I want this story to be anonymous, so I'm not even going to tell you where it happened. What I do have to tell you is that the city it happened in has a really large Thanksgiving Day parade every year. I'd never been to one of them before, but I always watched it on television. I went ahead and decided to go one year. I couldn't find anyone who wanted to go with me. None of my family or friends wanted to spend Thanksgiving standing in the cold, I guess. By the time I had gotten to the parade route, it was already really packed. I was worried whether or not I would be able to see that well. I'm not particularly tall, but I was able to find a spot behind another group of people that gave me a pretty good view of the parade route. I hadn't been there very long when I noticed someone who for some reason just caught my eye. I can't say there was anything unusual about him, really. He was rather big, a little unkempt, but there was just something about him. I, in fact, found myself continuously looking over at him. A few times that I was looking at the man, he caught me looking. As most people do when they are caught looking at someone, I quickly looked away each time. But even so, my curiosity got me to eventually start looking in his direction again. After a while, I could tell that he was getting annoyed. I resolved to try harder to not look at him, but that just made it worse. After a while, I looked at the man again and noticed that he was closer to me than he had been before. I didn't think about it at first because we were in a big crowd watching a parade. People moving around in the crowd were in no way unusual, but the more I glanced over at him, the closer and closer to me he kept moving. He was doing it casually, though, making his way around other people, but he was definitely coming in my direction. To test and see what he would do, I made my own way through the crowd toward the back of the sidewalk. I glanced at him, and he immediately switched course to be coming toward me. I was convinced he was coming at me, and I was mildly alarmed. However, I kept telling myself that it wasn't anything to worry about. I was at a parade with thousands of people. If the guy was going to try and hurt me, he would get caught pretty quickly. I guess that's the problem with assumptions, though. They really don't take all possible scenarios into account. The man did make his way over. There was only one person separating us when he stopped and went back to looking at the parade. I relaxed a bit, but when the man separating us moved, the guy moved up against me. I was about to move before I felt something sharp against my back. He had a knife, and probably because we were in a big crowd, he was able to hide the fact that he was holding it up against my back. To any bystanders, he looked like a guy in a crowd watching the parade. He asked me why I was staring at him over and over. I was too scared to speak at first, but when he asked again and moved the knife, I apologized, telling him that I didn't mean to stare. I didn't know why I was looking at him. He told me that he didn't believe me, and he asked me how much McMahon was paying me. I had no idea what he was talking about or who McMahon was, but he didn't believe me. He kept pushing on the knife and told me I had better tell him the truth. I heard my voice crack, and I pled to the guy to leave me alone, and that I didn't know what he was talking about. I guess my words were somehow heard over the noise of the parade, because two guys looked at us and then asked the guy what he was doing. I really just thought he was going to just stab me then and there. But I guess he figured that he would never be able to do it and then get away in this crowd. He slipped the knife away, didn't answer the two men, and took off. They didn't go after him, they just made sure I was alright. And to this day, I have no idea who McMahon was. But it doesn't really matter. I've been more careful to not stare at people, though.
Number 4. Shelter. I come from a very good upbringing. My family had it very good, and I never really had to be without anything. I try to give back as much as possible. I donate a lot of money to the poor and other things like that. One of the things that I am the proudest of is that on Thanksgiving, I volunteer my entire day at a local homeless shelter. I try to make sure that these much less fortunate people have as good as a day as possible. I stay in the shelter overnight and leave in the morning. One of the sadder things about working in a shelter is seeing the same people there year after year. I mean, I guess seeing them makes me happy that they're not dead, but it would be nice if the majority of them were able to get themselves a place to live and not have to leave on the streets anymore. Thanksgiving 10 years ago is one that I will never forget. There's not a lot of build-up to this story, so I apologize for that. The day and the evening went as well as it could. There was this one guy that I had never seen before, and normally I wouldn't have even thought much about it, but he was very annoying and very rude. At one point, he even tried to take the food away from another man. The rules of the shelter were that I was supposed to remove the man from the shelter for such an act. However, I could not bring myself to do that, not on Thanksgiving. I instead separated the two men and let the guy know that any further aggressive behavior would result in him being removed. The rest of the day and the night went fine, as far as I was aware. However, at about 3 in the morning, one of the other homeless guys came into the office. He told me that one of the other sleepers had been stabbed. I ran out and into the area, and sure enough, the man who nearly had his food stolen had been stabbed and he was dead. I turned on the lights. I searched around for the guy from dinner, and he was not here. I checked the bathroom, and the window was open. He had killed the one man, and then left as quietly and as quickly as he could. But the most horrific part of this was a man losing his life over something as simple as dinner. Even worse, for me, was that the man would likely still be alive if I had followed the rules and removed the man during dinner instead of letting him remain because it was Thanksgiving.
Number 5. First Thanksgiving alone. I moved out of my parents' house right when I turned 18. Nothing against them. I just wanted to live by myself and live in the city. I got myself a small studio apartment in Chicago. I had to work both the day before and the day after Thanksgiving that year, so I wasn't able to go home. Instead, I had a lonely day at home in my own apartment. I'd never cooked a Thanksgiving dinner before, and really didn't think I needed that much food, so I just got myself a big TV dinner. I really hadn't realized how lonely I would actually be, though. In fact, the loneliness was so overwhelming that I also began getting cabin fever. I think, in actuality, I just wanted to be around other people. So, after I had eaten my TV dinner, I went out and went for a walk. It was cold outside, and there weren't a whole lot of people out. Since I had moved to the city, it was the first time I had not seen literally swarms of people everywhere. I walked around on the street by the bars, but knew I wouldn't be able to get into any of them. I was out for quite a while before I decided I just wanted to go back to my apartment and be warm. So I headed back. When I got to my apartment, I put the key in the lock. I opened the door and went in. My apartment was a studio, and the only other room it had in it was a bathroom. Having walked around the city for a couple hours, and not having gone into any buildings, I really had to go to the bathroom. I always kept the bathroom door closed. I went in and didn't turn on the light. I just used the light from the rest of the house. When I was peeing, I got the strangest feeling. I felt very uncomfortable and like someone may have been watching me. My bathroom, strangely enough, had a window in it. It was actually on the wall of the shower, so I turned to look out the window and expected to see a bird or something. Instead, I came eye to eye with the form of a person behind the translucent shower curtain. It was a person, and he was looking directly at me. Startled, I fell backward. He opened the shower curtain. I scurried backward out of the bathroom. I made it to my feet and went for the door. However, before I got out, I felt the man grab me from behind. I struggled, but all he did was take me and throw me across the room. He then left the apartment, and the door slammed behind him. I got up as quickly as I could and locked the door. I then phoned the police. It didn't do any good, really. I noticed several items from my apartment were missing. Apparently, the guy was a burglar and didn't expect me to come back. I just caught him in the act, and he likely wasn't intent on harming me specifically. That didn't make discovering him in my bathroom any less scary, however. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope you enjoyed these 5 true scary Thanksgiving stories. I would like to think We Shouldn't Be Here for the collaboration. The second half of the collaboration is on his channel. Please visit his channel in the links provided, and make sure to subscribe while you're there. Now, if you want to see print versions of these stories, visit the Killer Orange Cat subreddit, where they have already been posted. Also, you can visit my sister's Killer Orange Cat merchandise store. She has an awesome Christmas sweater up right now. The links to both of these are provided in the description. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below or use the icon of Ichigo that will appear at the end of the closing. Feel free to leave a comment to let me know what you think of the video and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. My only requirement is that the story is original, meaning it has not been read on any other YouTube channel. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving, and please, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.